I'm back to Heavier Than Heaven, April 1st. A little bit of daylight left. What do we got? 5 p.m. now. We're up to Chapter 9. Too Many Humans. Olympia, Washington, May 1988 through February 1989. Slowly getting through this man's life here. Too Many Humans, the original title for Bleach. Sub Pop Records had begun in the fall of 1987 to issue records from Green River and Soundgarden, and among their first releases, 28-year-old co-owner Jonathan Poneman looked like a younger and more heavy-lidded version of Ruben Kinnaid, the manager of the Partridge Family's TV show, and his promotional scheme sounded straight out of Kinnaid's business plan, particularly his idea to send the group out in Sub Pop in a van. Most of the bands on the label noticed his shifty nature, and he was widely mistrusted. He had used a small inheritance to start a label fantasizing that it would be the Northwest's most equivalent of the Stax or Motown. He had many strengths as a promoter. Thinking Small was operating within a budget, and were not among them. Poneman's partner Bruce Pavitt was a longtime fixture in the Northwest scene, who had gone to Evergreen and Olympia, and Pavitt had befriended many bands and started a fanzine called the Subterranean Pop, later shortened to Sub Pop, and began to release cassette compilations, and he discontinued the fanzine, but in 1983 and 1988 wrote a widely read column in the Rocket, which Kurt studied with the rapt attention of most boys, only gave the baseball box scores. Pavitt, with the artistic visionary of Sub Pop, he looked the part, with his crazy man eyes, spooked expression, and penchant for unusual beards. He bore more than a passing resemblance of the mad Russian monk Grigorian Rasputin. By 1988, Sub Pop was issuing a handful of singles and EPs in every quarter, mostly Northwest bands. These projects made little business sense, and since the production cost of the singles was almost as high as the full-length album, yet they retailed for as much less. Sub Pop had little choice with the numbers of their bands, and many were so green they hadn't written enough material to fulfill the full-length album. From their inception, the label was burning through their capital like the internet startup. Yet they had stumbled onto a small market niche. Indie labels appealed to the record-collecting elitists, and in punk rock, these were the connoisseurs and were the taste markers, and by the development, a cachet on their label. And by coming up with a consistent design identity for their releases, they had bands clamoring to be on Sub Pop, if only to impress their friends, like hundreds of other young musicians who were on the bad at math. Kurt had a grandly romantic concept of what it meant to be on a record label, and Kurt's youthful illusions were quickly dashed. The band's first face-to-face business meeting with Poneman at the Cafe Romana at the Roma in Seattle was just as short disastrous. Chris showed up swigging a bottle of wine he had hid under the table, and Kurt started off shy, became angry when he realized that Poneman was offering far less than the band wanted, and it wasn't to be a question of money. Everyone knew there was little of that, and Kurt was just a jump-start of the band was the issuing of the slew of albums, EPs, and singles. Poneman suggested they begin with the single Love Buzz and see how it went from there, and Kurt admitted Love Buzz was their strongest live song, but as a songwriter he felt that just the disingenuous for a cover, for it to be the initial release. And nevertheless, at the end of the meeting, all the parties agreed that Nirvana would be on a record to single with it. Indino producing and the Sub Pop picking the recording costs. And to Kurt, the idea of having his own single out to be the fulfillment of a dream. Back in Grays Harbor, even the events transpired through a threatened to detail that dream. Not long after the Vogue show, Dave Foster had the misfortune to be beat up by the son of the mayor of Cosmopolis. He had spent 2 weeks in jail and lost his driver's license and had to pay thousands of dollars in medical bills. And it couldn't have been more worse for the time at Nirvana, who was rehearsing for an upcoming recording session, and so Kurt decided to fire Foster, and how he handled the dismissal says much about how he dealt with conflict, which was to say that he didn't. Kurt was always, and always has been, afraid of Foster, who was shorter than Kurt but had muscle, and like Popeye, initially the band brought back Aaron Buckhart. He ended up with the DWI in Kurt's car, and they again advertised for drummers. When they found one, Kurt wrote a letter to Foster. A band needs to practice, and in our opinion, at least 5 times a week, and if the band ever expects to accomplish anything, instead of lying to you by saying that we're breaking up or letting you go any further, would have to admit that we've got another drummer. His name is Chad, and he can make it to practice every night, and most importantly, we can relate to him. Let's face it, you are a total indifferent creature, and in a different culture. We feel really shitty that we don't have the guts to tell you this in person, but we also don't know how mad you get. And apparently, Kurt didn't have the guts to mail this letter. It was unsent, and Foster, of course, wasn't totally a different culture from Kurt's. He was the same culture, and though it was the past Kurt ought to escape, Foster found out that he was canned. And when he saw an ad at the Rocket, an upcoming Nirvana gig, Kurt and Chris had found Chad chanting at a show at the Community World Theater, and Kurt was wearing these big high-heel shoes and a wide sparkle flare pants, Chad recalled. And what Kurt and Chris noticed about Chad was his gigantic North drums. The kit was the biggest drum set they'd ever seen, dwarfing Chad. And with about 5'6", with long hair, and already looked like an elf, directness was not Kurt's forte, and rather than ask Chad to join the band, he simply kept inviting the drummer to practice until it became obvious that he was in the group. After one of those practices now scheduled back in Aberdeen, Chris' mother's hair salon, they could all play all night. Nirvana veterans decided to slow their new drummer at the local sites, and Chad was from the Bridge Island. Prior to joining Nirvana, they had never been to Aberdeen. The tour was a shock, and particularly the neighborhood that Kurt grew up in. It was like stepping into the south of the Bronx, Chad recalled. I thought to myself, holy crap, it's really bad. It's probably the poorest section of Washington, and all of a sudden you have the instant slum. Wow, I'm getting to a page that I actually had to tape. I had to have done that so long ago, and probably with one of my teacher's tape machines. It's crazy. I can totally remember reading this the first time when I was in all my classes in 8th grade. I read it in every class every day until the book was done. Never did any of my work in any of those classes. I used to use the class time to read. Because when I got home, I couldn't read fucking anything because my dad always wanted me to do something with him. Chad was more impressed when they drove gothic-looking Weatherwax High School. They also showed the drummer in a 5-story abandoned Finch building, and Kurt said that he had taken acid as he was a teenager. Though that could have been said for many of the sites in Aberdeen. They pointed out the old Dill's hand store, where a 25-cent album bin stood next to the 20-foot chainsaw. They went for the beer at the Poorhouse Tavern, where Chris seemed to know every other person. It was Redneck City, observed Chad. It was tons of dude with the skull behind their lips and with skull caps on and neon pink t-shirts and vans with mud flaps and mustaches. When they left the tavern, the two natives planned to take Chad to the haunted house in the hills above the town, and Chris pointed to the van north of and headed into what accounts for the Aberdeen's ritziest neighborhood, a hillside of the majestic Victorian homes constructed by a pioneer lumber bar. It was a pioneer lumber bar. But at the top of the hill, Chris headed to the van into the woods, and Kurt began to tell a story of the Aberdeen's haunted house, a place that locals called the castle. He said that people had gone in there and never come out. One room had pictures of clowns painted on the walls that was in blood, and as he talked, the hillside became heavily fostered with trees, and the overhanging became narrow. When they arrived at the castle, Chris pulled up to the driveway and killed the lights, but kept the engine running. In front of them was the structure that they had been a 3-story house before decay and caused it to crumble upon itself. There was moss on the roof, and the porch had caved in, and the whole rooms appeared to have been eaten away. Most was likely by small fires in the darkness, and shrouded by tree limbs. It really did look like the ruins of an old crumbled castle in some distant Transylvania backcountry. As the van idled, Chad wondered why Chris and Kurt had made a move to get out. They were just there staring at the house as they might look for an aspiration, and finally Kurt said to Chris, "Do you really want to go in?" Chris replied, "Nah, fuck it. I'm just going in there." "I'm not going in there." As Chad recalled later, he urged them to venture in, and since Kurt's stories made him curious, I was excited to check it out and see what was so scary. And when we got there, they just sat in the driveway. staring at the house, unable to move. Chad thought it'd dare him to part of the elaborate hazing rite to test his courage, and he had decided that no matter how frightening the house was, it was plenty scary, and he was not going to be too scared to go in. But when he looked at Kurt's face, he saw real fear, and well, people have died in there, Kurt explained. In 15 minutes it had taken the drive from the tavern to the house, and Kurt told such convincing stories of horror that he had begun to believe his own hyperbole. They turned and headed back to town, and Chad's tour of Aberdeen was over. Chris took Kurt's dualism at its face value, and for Chad to see the fear in Kurt's face was one of the first pieces of evidence that he was the band leader and was more complicated than he appeared. With the new recording session scheduled for the second week of June, Kurt, filled with anticipation and excitement, he could talk virtually about nothing else. During May, announcing the upcoming date to everyone he knew and didn't like, the new father, overwhelmed with pride, he'd tell the mailman or the grocery clerk the band had played a couple of gigs that month in their sea legs, and with Chad, including a return visit to the Vogue party at the Witch House for the Olympian musician Gilly Hunter, Hanner 21, May 14th, 1988, a friend invited them as an entertainment. They were not like any evergreen band, she remembered. Their sound hit you, and you'd think that you'd heard it before, but then you hadn't. It was more rock and roll than the stuff of the era, and without noodling. At a party, Kurt just joined Gilly to sing a version of Scratch Acids, The Greatest Gift. The time, Love Buzz was the best thing at their show, and Kurt was still struggling to settle on an original sound raw enough to appeal to the punk sensibilities that displayed increasingly complicated lyrics. Far too often the band's shows turned into loud feedback sessions, where virtually Kurt's words were to be heard above the din. While Kurt's expectations for the single grew, financial problems within Sub Pop doomed the project. One May afternoon, Kurt picked up the phone, only to hear that Pavitt asking to borrow $200. It was so laughable it didn't anger Kurt, though it incensed Chris and Chad and Tracy. We were shocked, remembered Chad. At this point, we began our suspicion about the guys. Kurt would have been more upset had he known that Sub Pop had his second thoughts about the band's creativity. The label wanted one more look, so Poneman hastily arranged a show at the Central Tavern on June 5th, a Sunday night. Gregor, who booked the club, put Nirvana into the middle slot on a three-band evening, and the night before the date, Poneman called Gregor and asked if Nirvana could be moved into the lineup to go on first. Poneman's explanation was that it's Sunday night. We don't want to stay out late. When the band went on, there were 6 people in the audience. Chris Knapp at KMCU was one of them. Bruce and John were at the front of the stage, shaking their heads up and down, and they must have seen something no one else could, because they thought they sucked. Because I thought they sucked. This particular gig, and so many as to follow, was plagued by sound problems, which put Kurt in a bad mood and compromised his performance, and despite the crummy sound and the lackluster of the live show, Poneman and Pavitt decided to proceed with the single. On June 1st, Nirvana returned to the Reciprocal for the session, and this time producer Indino knew how to spell Kurt's name. But the quick and easy studio experience for the first demo was not to be repeated. In the 5 hours, they finished only one song, and part of the problem came because Kurt brought the song along on cassette and the sound collage he wanted on the single. The only way for this to happen was the studio's crude gear was to hit play button in the cassette deck to correct the pointing during the mixing. The band returned on June 30th for 5 more hours and did a final session on July 16th, and it consisted of 3 hours mixing. In the end of this 13-hour stint, 4 tracks, Love Buzz, a new version of Spank through to Cobain's originals Big Cheese, which was one of the B-sides in the blandest. Sub Pop hired Alice Wheeler to photograph the band for the sleeve, and during the last week of August, they drove up in Seattle in Chris' van to pick her up. Their first official photo session was so anticipated that they all took the day off work. Chris returned everyone to Tacoma, where they shot in several locations, including Never Never Land, At a Point Distance Park, and a foot of Tacoma's Narrows Bridge. Chris wore a short-sleeved dress shirt and wore over his 2 tiny bandmates. In all the pictures, Chad wore a Germs t-shirt and a beret, and round sunglasses, which gave him the appearance of the band leader. Kurt was a light-hearted mood, smiling for most of the photos. with his long, girlish hair and his Harley-Davidson t-shirt, lived to ride. He looked so young to drive, much less in a rock band. He had an outbreak of acne the week before, and something he'd struggled with since high school, which gave him the self-consciousness. Wheeler told him that she was using infrared film, so his zits weren't going to show. And by the time the band drove back to Seattle, they had spent much of the time on the photos of the session as they did at the studio. In late August, Kurt received another unusual phone call from Poneman, and like the previous conversations, he couldn't help but feel like he was being conned. Poneman informed Kurt that Sub Pop was starting a new subscription of only single service. They planned Love Buzz would be the debut release of their singles club, and Kurt had hardly believed his ears. Discussing it later with his bandmates, he was outraged. Not only had the single taken months later than planned, but now it wasn't even going to be for sale in stores. It hardly seemed worth the effort, and as a collector, Kurt appreciated the club idea. He wasn't interested in seeing his band at the test case, and since he didn't have a contract and Sub Pop had paid for the recording, and also he didn't have much choice. Not long after April's show at the Vogue, Kurt had gotten a phone call from Don Anderson, wanting an interview for the band back at the fanzine, and rather than conduct an interview with the phone, Kurt offered to drive up to Seattle, making them seem like he'd already had the business there, which he didn't, and though Kurt waited for moments. More than he didn't, and though Kurt waited for the moment for the years, he had prepared it with the fake interviews with himself, and he had written in his youth. In his first press interaction, he became nervous and shy, and most of the hour interview ended up being about the Melvins, a subject that Kurt seemed more comfortable with than his own band, Reed recalled. Reading a transcript, one could almost think that he was a member of the Melvins, not Nirvana. He idolized the Melvins, observed Anderson, something that had been obvious in the Grace Harpers for years. But like Sub Pop singles, which again had to be delayed in late August, the article was on hold for a few months. With many of the delays that he couldn't control, Kurt felt like he was the only one in the world ready for his musical career. And the Backlash article finally ran in September. Even Kurt was surprised to see that Anderson's 500-word story with the Melvins' name appeared twice as many times as Nirvana's. "I've seen hundreds of Melvins practices," Kurt said. "I drove their van on tour. Everybody hated them, by the way." The piece was flattering and it was helpful, but plugging the upcoming Love Buzz single. Yet, when Kurt said one of the biggest beginnings, our biggest fear at the beginning was that people might think that we were a Melvins ripoff. A casual reader might have had a similar concern, and Kurt explained their Vogue debut. "We were uptight. We felt like we were being judged. It was like everyone should have had scorecards." The scorecards line in the first press review reprised the imaginary Kurt had put forth in his letter to Grover. He had also used later in interviews. It came forth as his divided self, the same self that his name was spelled. Kurt, it's K-U-R-D-T, Kurt Cobain. With the interviews and the fans, and they read these stories, they never knew it was almost every word he uttered had been rehearsed in his head, and with the band driving around in the van, or the many instances actually written out in his journals. This wasn't simply the craftiness on his part of desire that was put forth marketably by the attractive image, though despite all the punk ideals he spouted, and like any other human being, intricately guilty of this, but much of the forethought occurred instinctually. He had imagined these moments since he had been retreating from the outside world after his parents' divorce, spending much of the time in his room writing the Peaches notebooks. When the world tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Mr. Cobain, we were ready for your close-up," he planned on how he'd walk to the cameras, and going as far as to rehearse the way that he would shrug his shoulders, as so to give the impression that he had only grudgingly acquiesced to nowhere. And was Kurt's forethought more apparent than that of his band bio he wrote that summer to send out to Indino on the demo tape? He had given the tape many times in titles, but one of the most often was "Safer Than Heaven." That was only meant that Kurt knew that he wrote dozens of drafts of the bio, only to each revision to be exaggerated. One of the many examples read like this: "Nirvana is from Olympia, Washington, 60 miles from Seattle. Nirvana's guitar vocalist Kurt Cobain and the bassist Chris Novoselic lived in Aberdeen, 150 miles from Seattle. Aberdeen's population consists of highly bigoted redneck snooze-chewing, deer-shooting, faggot-killing logger types who ain't too partial to weirdo new waves. Chad Channing, the drummer, is from the island of rich kid LSD abusers. Nirvana is a trio who plays heavy rock music with punk overtones, and they usually don't have jobs, so they can't tour anytime. Nirvana has never jammed on Gloria or Louie Louie, and nor have they ever had to rewrite these songs and call them their own. Another, only slightly different version was sent to Touch and Go, and says of the Follow Downcast plea, "We are willing to pay for the majority of the pressing copies of 1,000 and all the recording costs. We basically just want to be on your label. Do you think you could please send us a reply of fuck off or not interested, so as we don't have to waste any more money sending more tapes?" On the flip side of the tape, he has recorded a collage of included snippets of songs of Cher, The Partridge Family, Led Zeppelin, Frank Zappa, Dean Martin, and other kinds of dozen desperate dispatch artists. Kurt offered to pay the label to put his own record out. It seems increasingly the level of desperation. He drafted the letter to Mark Langan of the Screaming Trees and asking for help, and Langan was one of the number one of his idols. Kurt regularly wrote in his journal, rarely mailing his correspondence. He wrote, "We'd feel like we're not accomplishing anything, and it turns out our single will be out in October. But there isn't much hope for an EP and within the future because Sub Pop is having financial problems, but the EP or the LP within a year just wasn't a bullshit excuse for Poneman to keep us from scouting other labels." Kurt also wrote to his friend Jesse Reed, declaring that his band was going to be self-releasing their own LP, and since they were so sick of Sub Pop. Despite Kurt's frustrations, things were already getting better with the band, and they had some time in, though it could never be the fast enough for Kurt. Shelley had broken up with Christ, which resulted in Chris having more time to practice. Kurt was happy to finally have two other bandmates who were into the band as he was. On October 28th, they landed their most prestigious gig yet, opening for the Butthole Surfers at Seattle's Union Station. Kurt idolized Gibby Haynes, lead singer of the Surfers, so the show was very important to him. The sound problems again detailed Nirvana from putting on their best performance, but the very fact that Kurt now announced to his friends, "My band opened for Gibby Haynes," and was another piece of evidence to boost his self-esteem. Fucking lucky son of a bitch. It's gotta be fucking a huge ego boast. Two days later, they played their most infamous show, one that turned Olympia's hearts. It was a party at Evergreen's K-Dorm, and on that day before Halloween, Kurt and Chris made themselves up for the occasion by putting fake blood on their necks. There were three bands who played before Nirvana: Ryan Ager's band of the Clyodes, Dave Foster's latest group Helltrout, and the new band fronted by Kurt's neighboring Slim Moon, called Nisqually Delta Podunk Nightmare. In the middle of Nisqually's set, the drummer punched Slim in the face and had a fight ensued. It was such a wild rumble that Kurt wondered what Nirvana could possibly do to upstage such an event. He almost didn't get the chance as the campus police showed up to shut the party down. Ryan Ager stepped forward and convinced the officers to let Nirvana play, but they were told to be quick. When Nirvana finally took the stage, or more accurately, moved to the corner of the room, acting as a stage, they played only a 25-minute set, but the show had transformed them from Aberdeen Hicks to Olympia's most beloved band. Kurt's intensity was something that had been lacking in other performances and found a new depth, and not one person in the room could take their eyes off him. As reserved as he was when he was off stage, remembered Slim Moon, when he wanted to be on, he went all out. And on this one night, he played with the intensity that I had never seen. They were the same songs and riffs that the band had been performing for some time, but with an added more attraction of a possessed lead singer. They were more mesmerizing. He had surprisingly a confidence now in front of the microphone, and it was nowhere else in his life. Kurt had increased energy, which seemed to egg on Chris, who bounced around so much that he smacked several members of the crowd with his bass. But the coup de grace was to come at the end of the short set. Right after they played Love Buzz, Kurt lifted a relatively new Fender Mustang guitar, brought it down to the ground with such violence that its pieces shot across the room like projectiles from a cannon. He paused for the 5 seconds, and hosted the remnants in the air, and held it there while eyeing the crowd, and Kurt's face appeared serene and spooky, and as if he had taken Casper the Friendly Ghost Halloween mask and placed it onto the body of a 21-year-old man. The guitar went up into the air, and then the smash hit the floor, and once more Kurt dropped it and walked out of the room. He had never smashed a guitar before, and probably even before the thought about the act, since the guitars were expensive. He had never explained why he freaked out, John Pukley said. John Perky, but he was smiling there with the finality to it. It was like his own little private celebration. No one got hurt when he smashed the guitar. It was as if he didn't really care about to hurt anyone. It was completely out of the blue, and I was taken to him after the show, and the guitar was laying there on the floor, and the people kept grabbing pieces of it, and the Greeners now couldn't get enough of Nirvana. 3 weeks after Kurt got the call from Sub Pop from his Love Buzz single was ready to finally be out, he and Chris drove to Seattle to pick it up. Sub Pop's Daniel House recalled they insisted on hearing it on the office stereo. We played it for them. I don't think they ever saw Kurt happier. Both Kurt and Chris particularly happy about the inside joke on the release. Kurt's name was spelled Kurt, and forever confusing the reviewers and the fans, and a tiny message scratched into it on the groove of the vinyl that read, "Why don't you trade?" Those guitars for shovels. This was the line Kurt's father would frequently yell at him in his broken, Croat-inflected English during their Aberdeen practices. Trade those guitars for shovels. Guitars for shovels, guitars for guns. From Aberdeen to Sub Pop, it seemed like a blur, and now that Kurt was holding his own record in his hand, here was the final tango proof that he was a real musician, and like his guitar that he used to take to school in Montesano, even when it was broken, when outcome for success was a single mattered little. It was a very physical existence that what he had started for over many years. The band kept almost 100 of the edition and 1,000 of the Love Buzz singles, and while in Seattle, Kurt dropped off a copy to the college radio station KCMU, and he had the high hopes for the singles, describing in the station a beautifully soft, mellow, crooning sleep jingle. Incredibly commercial, he kept the KMCU to immediately add it up to the track rotation, so he kept listening all day. Tracy had come to Seattle to drive Kurt back to Olympia, and they prepared to go home. The song had to come on. As they drove south and reached the outer KMCU signal, Kurt simply couldn't wait any longer as he ordered Tracy to pull over at a gas station, where he used a payphone to call and request his own single as to whether the station's DJ thought this odd, getting a single from a band and then having apparently a random listener request it 2 hours later isn't known. And Kurt waited more than a half hour in the car, and then finally the station played Love Buzz. He sat there, hearing himself come out of the radio, Tracy remembered, with a big smile on his face. And Kurt began December 1988 in some of the best spirits of his life. The single had buoyed his mood, and people were talking about the K-Dorm show, and when he got to the Smithsville Cafe, or the Spar coffee shop, college kids would whisper to themselves as he walked in. People started to ask him to play at their parties, and they still weren't offering to pay him, but they were asking. And the rocket for the band, with their first review calling the single one hell of a first show. The rocket piece was a laudatory, but it warned, and the attention of the other sub-pop bands were getting. Nirvana could be overshadowed, but both in the scene and within their label, serious traces of musicianship leaked through. Grant Alden wrote, "Nirvana is sort of the edge of the current to Northwest sound, and too clean for the too pure metal and too good to ignore." It was the first evidence of something that Kurt suspected but couldn't confirm without outside validation. The band was getting better. Inside Sub Pop, there were label mates of Soundgarden, Mudhoney, and clearly other favorites. Nirvana's stock went up in the single club. It turned out that the smart marketing move after all. The first pressings of Love Buzz sold out, and though the band didn't have the time to make a dime off it, it sounded impressive. There was other good news. Poneman and Pavitt had stated and slated the remix version of Spank through for the EP collection and Sub Pop's 200, the label's highest profile release so far, and Sub Pop were now interested in talking to Kurt about a full-length album. There was one big caveat. Since the label was broke, Nirvana would have to pay the upfront cost for recording, and this to the contrary, the way that most record labels worked. The contrary was the way that Sub Pop operated, and with other bands, though Kurt never sent one of his "we're willing to pay" you out of to put our record out. Letters to Sub Pop. His combinations of hunger and ignorance was a way more to savvy Povelman. Checkbook in hand, the band excitedly made plans to go back into the studio with Jack and Dino at the end of December. Once Kurt had an album to focus on, he immediately began to distance himself from the Love Buzz single, with only 2 weeks before he had been the most precious possession in the world. He talked about it with Slim Moon, who said that he had left the impression that Kurt didn't like anything about it, except the fact that they now had something that was out, and Kurt sent a copy of the single to John Perky and included the following note. Here's what we have commercialized in rock star stupid fuzzy Sub Pop picture sleeve, limited edition single featuring Kurt Cobain on the front and back. I'm gladly only 1,000 were printed, and the LP will be different, very different. A rawer production with raunchier songs, and even writing to a friend, he spoke to himself in the third person. His love-hate relationship with the single mirrored his approach to all his work, and nothing about the band that he ever did in either a studio or on stage matched the way that it sounded in his head. He loved the idea of the record until it came out, and then immediately he had to find something wrong with it and was a part of a larger dissatisfaction. This was most evident in his relationship with Tracy, and she loved him completely, and yet he rejected her sentimentality and told her that she shouldn't love him so much. Note exchanges continued as their main method of communicating, and her to-do list grew longer, and since he rarely did anything she asked, even when he was unemployed and living off of her, in December of 1988 she left him the following note. Hi Kurt, I'll be home at 2:30 or 3. Before you turn on the TV, could you straighten up the bedroom? You could fold the clothes and put them in the drawer. It's just in the inside closet on the left. Put the fresh newspapers down. Shake the rugs in the bathroom and the kitchen. Clean the tub and sink. And toilet. I'm sorry, I'm a naggy bitch lately. I love you. Let's get drunk, semi, and fuck tonight. Love you. Kurt and Tracy struggled their messy breakup. Kurt and Tracy struggled with a messy breakup between Chris and Shelley. From Kurt's perspective, it gave Chris more time for the band, but for Tracy, the split had removed the best couple's best buddies. It was but for Tracy that the split. It was as if Lucy and Ricky had to watch Ethel and Fred divorce. They found herself frequently worrying about whether she and Kurt were next, if only because she knew a breakup would allow him to devote every waking hour to the band, and she decided to test his commitment by threatening to break up. And she didn't really want to split, she just wanted him to tell her that he was committed. But any test of the wills, Kurt was a mistake and obstinate, and he responded practically when she told him to move out. If you want me to move out, I'll go live in my car. He said he'd lived in his cars before, and he would do it again. He lived in cars before, and he would do it again. She, of course, told him this was nonsense, but Tracy mistakenly began a game of who will blink first, with the reigning Grays Harbor champion. Even with the band finally happening, life for Kurt went on much as it had before. He rose late and spent all day writing songs or playing his guitar while watching television. One afternoon, Tracy complained that he had written songs about almost everything in the world, and from masturbation to characters of the Mayberry RFD, Floyd the Barber, except her. He laughed at the suggestion, but he pondered it in his journal. I would love to write a pretty song for her, even though I have no right to speak for her. On the same page, he was less romantic. And when he portrayed himself as a character with no arms, I gesture and grunt for your affection, wielding my flippers in a windmill circle. My blib is soiled with the lost attempts to contact you through saliva communication, drivel and drying to my chest. One of the many obsessions was flipper babies, infants born without arms. He wrote about the topic regularly and drew freakish illustrations of what he imagined they looked like. A week later, he wrote a song about his girlfriend. The chorus went, I can't see you every night for free, a direct reference to their arguments. Strangely, though, he rehearsed and played the song in front of her, and he never admitted it was about her. Instead, he told her, I just write what comes into my head, and I don't write anything about you or anyone else. He was lying, and of course, but the first in fact that he would create this gift for her, but not willing to risk the intimacy of presenting it. Says much about the relationship and his commitment to it. It was like A junior high school boy who leaves a Valentine for a girl but doesn't have the courage to sign his name. And when the song he played for Chad and Chris, they liked it immediately and asked its name. I have no idea, Kurt said. What's it about? Chad asked. It's about a girl, Kurt said. And they decided that we'd do that for the title. Most of Kurt's titles had only a minor relationship to the lyrics anyway. About a Girl was an important song for Kurt's development as a writer, and it was the first straight-out-of-head love song. Even if its lyrics were twisted and so unabashedly melodic that Nirvana's early live performance audiences mistook it for a Beatles cover, Kurt sold Stevie Schillinger that day that he wrote a song about a girl, and he played the Meet the Beatles for 3 hours straight to get into the mood. This was hardly necessary. Ever since he was a toddler, he studied their work, even as though they considered the passe punk in circles. By the end of 1988, Kurt's musical influences were strange. A potpourri of punk that he learned at Buzz Osborne's knee. The heavy metal he listened to as a teenager, and the pop that he discovered in early childhood with Little Rhymeries and with the groupies, and there was the huge hunks of music history he missed simply because he hadn't even been exposed to them. He still hadn't heard Patti Smith or the New York Dolls, yet in other small pockets, like when it came to Scratch Acid, he was the sort of expert who could tell you every track they released. Oh, man, that's better. He had a tendency to fall in love with the group and embrace their music above all else. Prose stylizing to his friends at the doorstep preacher. Chris had a better grasp of the larger rock of Over, and one reason that Chris remained essential to the band, Chris knew what was Kish. And while Kurt had erred in his early category, in late 1988, Kurt summoned his friend Damon Romero, to his apartment by telling him, "There's this great record I've discovered that you have to hear." When Romero arrived, Kurt pulled out the Knack's album, Get the Knack, and moved toward the turntable with it. Romero was all familiar with this 1979 release, which could have been considered mainstream. Though Kurt was being sarcastic and inquired, "Are you serious?" "No, you've got to listen to this. It's an awesome pop album." Kurt was a deadpan replay. Kurt put the record on, and Romero uncomfortably sat through both sides of the disc, wondering the whole while where there was some sort of punchline to come. And yet Kurt closed his eyes and was silent as it spun, playing air drums with his hands as a quiet homage. Shortly after Love Buzz was released, Kurt made a mixtape for his friend Tam Ormond that displayed his favorite current music. Inside included From the Red Cross, Ozzy Osbourne, Queen of the Bay, City Rollers, Sweet Saccharine Trust, The Velvet Underground, Venom, The Beatles, and The Knack, and he titled The Knack's My Sharona as My Scrotum. Side B included on tracks from dissimilar bands Soundgarden, Blondie, Psychedelic Furs, Metallica, Jefferson Airplane, The Melvins, AC fucking DC, as he wrote the name. It took hours to make a tape like this, but Kurt had nothing but time. With the gift, he was hoping to interest Ormond in managing Nirvana. Realizing that Sub Pop wasn't looking out for his interest, he might better represent them. At one point, he and Tracy considered moving to Tacoma with Tam. After looking at several houses, Kurt nixed the idea when he saw a bullet hole in the wall. Ormond had instead moved to Seattle, which Kurt seemed to be the only qualification needed for the band's manager, and on the day they picked up Love Buzz single, they stopped by her place, and Kurt announced that she was the new manager, and he gave her a stack of records and asked her to send them to Touch and Go and anyone else she might think that would be interested. She put together a crude press kit which included pictures from the K-Dorm show and their party press clippings. Even on the day the single came out, Ormond remembered Kurt acted like he hated Sub Pop. The fall, Kurt had ordered Donald Passman's book, All You Need to Know About the Music Business, from the library, and after reading it and sharing the information with Chris, he became more suspicious of his label and decided they needed a contract. The next week, Chris drove to Seattle and drunkenly pounded on Pavitt's door, yelling, "You fuckers, we want a contract." The Sub Pop drafted a short contract that went into full effect January 1st, 1989. It called for 3 albums over 3 years and scheduled Kurt too slow. The label was to pay the band $6,000 for the first year, $12,000 for the second, and $24,000 for the third. The band spent most of December rehearsing for the upcoming session, since the practice space was in Aberdeen and travel could take up most of a day, and Chad only occasionally had a car, and Kurt's vehicle was also hardly dependable. Most of the days, Chris would drive his van from Aberdeen to Olympia to pick up Kurt, head north to Seattle to pick up Chad, who wanted to take the ferry from the Main Bridge, and then they'd drive all the way back to Aberdeen at the end of the day, and the route would be reversed, and some days they'd drive as many as 400 miles to accomplish this 3-hour practice. Still, there were benefits to this commuting. It began to foster a sense of togetherness and gave them an uninterrupted time to listen to music. We listened to Mudhoney, Tad, Coffin Break, the Pixies, the Sugar Cubes, remember Chad, the list of bands they listened to, and good description of Nirvana's sound in 1988. As of any, they managed to sound both derivative and original, and at times within the same song. Kurt was also learning quickly. On December 21st, 1988, the band returned to their first official hometown show in Grays Harbor, Nirvana. And though they were starting out to draw crowds in Olympia and Seattle, the appearances they played to an audience of 20, mostly Klingons. The venue was the Holocron of Eagles Hall, just 2 blocks from the Chevron station where Kurt's father had once worked, and Chris stripped down to his underwear and began pouring blood on himself. They played Led Zeppelin's Immigrant Song, and for the first time in concert, the cover elicited a bigger response than any of Kurt's originals, and the show marked the first time Kurt's sister, who was still in high school, had seen her brother in concert. I sat on the edge of the stage singing along, Kim recalled. I lost my voice. I wasn't supposed to get up the next day. I was supposed to get up the next day in class and give a book report, but I couldn't. That week, Kurt sent his grandparents, Leland and Iris, a Hallmark Christmas card. Inside the card, he included the note of updating them of his professional progress. Dear long-lost grandparents, I miss you very much. Which, in no excuse, is my non-visiting. I'm not very busy living in Olympia. When I'm not on tour with my band, we put out a single recently, and it has sold out already. We are recording a debut LP this Monday, which will be released in March, and in February we're going on tour again in California. And then we'll be back in April, only to take a break and then go on the road again. I'm happier than I've ever been, and it would be nice to hear from you as well. Merry Christmas. Love, Kurt. Kurt exaggerated the band's touring schedule. Their shows were still infrequent, but increasing in pace. But he wasn't exaggerating himself, describing himself as happier than he had ever been. The anticipation of the upcoming career milestone was always more joyous to him than the actual event of the idea of the full-length album. Something far more significant than a single, he presumed, filled him with enough levity and uncharacteristically talked his inner emotions. It was rare acknowledged how he felt for himself rather than for him to describe himself as happy. 2 days after the Hot Queen gig, the band drove to Seattle to record their album. It was Christmas Eve. We had nothing else to do, explained Chris. They had spent the night before at Jason Everman's house, a friend of Chad and Dylan's. As a typical, Kurt had written melodies out of his lyrics, and so he stayed up most of the night finalizing his words, and he told his bandmates he couldn't sleep anyway. They arrived at the studio the next morning and worked deep into the night. During the session, they laid down the basic tracks for 10 songs, but Kurt didn't like his vocal takes. The only track that he fancied was Blue, which had been the victim of a bit of serendipity. Chris had forgotten which key he was in and mistakenly tuned down 1 notch below drop D, tuning the song was written in. The result was a sound that was heavier and deeper than anything they had done before, and the perfect mistake. Like many of the early songs, Kurt wrote lyrics to Blue and didn't make sense. They were, as Kurt later explained, simply cool things to sing, but the melody and the lyrics effectively communicated hopelessness and despair, and themes were prevalent through most of Kurt's songs. About midnight, the band called it quits and headed back to Aberdeen. On the long drive home, they listened to the session 6 times in a row. Chris dropped Kurt back in Aberdeen at Wendy's house at 1:30 in the morning on Christmas Day of 1988. He planned to spend the holiday there before heading back to see Tracy. And on the surface, Kurt and Wendy's relationship seemed improved. That fall, he wrote in his journal, "We get along now that I moved out. I've done what my mother wants, and she thinks that I have a respectable job, a girlfriend, a car, and a house. I need to retrieve some old stuff that I left at my home, my old home, my real home, now simply my mother's home." Kurt usually made Christmas presents for his family by hand, both out of artistic preference and economic necessity. In 1987, handcrafted keychains, but gifts in 1988 were no barrier. He gave everyone, including his aunts and uncles, copies of the single. Having a record created a homecoming of sorts for him. He had now had evidence proof to his relatives that he was making something of himself. Wendy played the single on the family stereo, but it was clear that she wasn't impressed. She told him he needed something else to fall back on, and Kurt would hear none of it. More exciting than Christmas was yet another high-profile show that the band had played on December 28th at an underground in Seattle for the release of the Sub Pop 200 box set, even while struggling to pay there. Bands Sub Pop threw lavish parties, and at this event was no exception. It was an 8-band, 2-a-day affair, U District Club. Nirvana was on the first night and introduced by Steve Jesse Bernstein as the band with the frenzied, dried vocals. The show marked with the first of the times Nirvana was on an equal billing with the rest of Sub Pop's roster. Previously, they had been considered a baby band, and they stayed in Seattle, and during the next 3 days, another 15 hours in the studio with Indino, working until the early evening of New Year's Eve. Kurt finally retreated to Olympia to start out 1989 with Tracy. The second week of January, the band was back out for 2 more sessions of mixing, and they were there to close and done. After almost 30 hours in the studio, they had 9 tracks. They chose to use 3 of the Crover demos on the album, and they all remixed those. Kurt had decided the album would be called Too Many Humans, which wasn't the name of any individual song, but summed up the dark thesis of his work. But in early February, the band headed to California on tour, and while driving through San Francisco, Kurt saw an AIDS prevention poster that struck his funny. It read, "Bleach your works." "Bleach," he said to his band names as they drove down the street. "That's going to be the name of our next album." And that there's the end of chapter 9. Almost said 8. Oof, that was a long one. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.